I want to introduce our last speaker, amazing woman. It's Reverend Deborah Phillips. She's an ordained metaphysical minister, teacher, and writer. Her passion is spiritual exploration. In addition to her one-on-one sessions, she facilitates discussion groups and workshops, all of which are meant to help people open to that untouched place within, the mystical you. She's also the author of Untangling Your Thoughts, a book of short essays on spiritual living. Her soul talk is called The Gift of Grief. Please put your hands together and welcome my dear friend, Reverend Deborah Phillips.
Thank you, RJ. JG.
No, JG.
The initial guys. When I started to write this talk, I couldn't come up with an opening. I kept thinking I have to have, that cool opening with the joke and the get everybody ready thing, and it wouldn't work. And even when I was rewriting this talk at 2 o'clock on Wednesday morning, I still couldn't come up with a good opening, and now I know why. It's because I needed to hear what everybody else had said so far today in order to move into what I'm going to talk about. And what you talked about, that middle place where you're not within and you're not out here and you're stuck in this middle stuff. And that's the story I'm going to tell you today. RJ said, I want you to be vulnerable. I want you to tell the story about personal healing. So here's the story. After my mother died in 1983, I decided that it was a good opportunity to distance myself from my family. Now, we're not a horribly dysfunctional family. We tend to go the way of passive-aggressive, controlling, judgmental. But I don't have the horror stories that some of my friends have. I mean, I have some friends that I can't believe that they're functional. So I'm very grateful I didn't have that. But still, there was enough discomfort that I thought, as did my therapist, that a little distance from the family could probably be really good for my spiritual, mental, emotional health. And so in 1984, I moved to Sacramento. Now, my sister, who was the safest person in the family, which is, I'm using that loosely, she lived in the Bay Area, but it was far enough away that I could see her once in a while and still maintain the distance. And I did try for a little while to be really close, and it just didn't work. It just wasn't good for me. And so I backed off again. And she was a little hurt by that, but that's all I could do. And then in the early 1990s, she moved to Colorado. That was helpful, and it's also, we started to really grow apart at that point. We talked on the phone a little bit, but that was about it. And then in 2005, when my husband Jim and I decided to get married, I decided, well, I'm going to try family again. I think it's because, I have backup now, right? I'm not alone anymore. And so I tried that. And so then we got to where we talked, every month or so. She came to California once in a while. We met in some neutral places. I did not go to her house. And in my defense, I have to tell you, to get to my sister's house, you flew from Sacramento to Denver, then you got in a car and you drove south for 3 hours. Then you turned right and you drove another 2 hours. And then there was a sign that said, middle of nowhere. You turned left and went another 7.5 miles, and there you are at my sister's house. So between the fact that it was inconvenient and expensive to get there, it was a great excuse to maintain that distance. So we got to the point where we talked on the phone occasionally, we saw each other at the occasional wedding, but there was distance, and I was fine with that distance. Certainly my emotional life was on a much better keel, so that was good, right? Well, late in 2012, my sister called me, and she said she was really, really sick. She told me what her symptoms were, and I knew immediately what it was. She had ovarian cancer. Took the doctors another 2 weeks to say she had cancer and another 2 weeks to say what it was. And so she started into that whole cycle of the surgery and the chemo and all the things that people do. But it was already too late, and I think she knew it. I certainly knew it. And because of this distance, because we hadn't spent that much time together, I thought, I'm going to be okay with this. I don't have, my spiritual perspective on life after death is really, I think, pretty healthy, or delusional, I'm not sure which, but it gets me through. And like I said, she wasn't part of my everyday life. So I thought, yes, it'll feel like a loss, but it won't be horrible. She did distancing herself this time. This was a time when I was ready to be there. I was ready to come visit, whatever we needed to do to work this out. Well, she distanced. She didn't want to talk about it, at least not when I called her. She and her husband were having a really, really hard time coming to terms with the situation. And so I backed off and let her call me whenever she needed to. And she would call, and I would listen. And she told me later that was just knowing I was there, even if she didn't call, just knowing I was there was really helpful to her. And then finally the call came that it was time to come say goodbye. So that last week, my nephew went and spent a couple of nights and left. My brother went and spent a couple of nights and left. And then Jim and I made the trek to 7.5 miles north of the middle of nowhere to say goodbye to her. And she was awake when I got there on a Wednesday night, and we talked. And then the next day, Thursday, we talked. And I said to her at one point, I said, even though we had some bad times, I have always loved you. And she said, yeah, of course. Everybody goes through that. So it's like she was ready to let it go and move on, and so did I. So on Friday morning, she made her transition, and I spent most of that day just sort of running interference for her husband so that he didn't have to deal with people that first time. But he didn't want us to stay there. He wanted to be alone. So we got in the car on Saturday morning and left. And yeah, I cried a little bit. I got in the car, and we drove off, and I went to pieces. I sobbed, and I sobbed, and I sobbed, and Jim drove and looked at me, and he stopped at a store and bought a box of Kleenex. And I thought, all right, this is fresh, it's new. Siblings are forever, right? If you have a sibling, they've just always been there. So I thought, this will pass. Well, we got home, and for months, I was still a mess. I would be fine, and then something would happen, and I'd be blubbering. I'd be sitting in a corner sobbing my brains out. And I'm thinking of all my spiritual tools and the meditation and all these different things. And there's something in my head that said, this grief is outsized for the thing that's happened. It's just bigger than what happened, and I couldn't understand it. During this time, though, my nephew, who was devastated by his mother's death, he said, I'm too young to have my mother die. He called me every single night, and we talked on the phone every single night for the entire year. And during that time, we found out that he was raised almost exactly the same way I was raised. We had the same programming in our heads. And so I got this wonderful experience of getting a perspective of what it sounded like for him when something was said to him, and what it sounded like for me, because I'm 20 years older than he is. And it helped me put a lot of things into place. It helped me solve some things. It helped me move forward and let a lot of the childhood stuff go, or say, they did it to all of us. But I still couldn't figure out why this grief was so big. It was, I don't know, I was so devastated on a level that didn't make sense to me. And so after all of these conversations with Eric and all of this stuff, one day I got it, and I don't know how I got it. I think I just chipped away at it long enough that something happened. And yeah, my sister died and I was sad. Yes, I missed her. But here's the thing that ripped my heart out. for all those years of being distant, I also carried in my head the idea that one day my sister was going to get her head out of her dysfunction, and we would be able to be comfortable with each other, and we would be friends, and we would have Christmas together. It was a fantasy of cinematic proportions. And when my sister died, that fantasy died with her. And that was the day I lost my family. I was devastated by the loss or the death of an idea, ladies and gentlemen. It was just an idea. I had told myself that I was fine, this distance was okay, I didn't need family, I didn't want family. They were dangerous, right? And I kept myself safe by running that secret fantasy in the back of my mind, and I had it hidden so deeply I didn't know I had it. The blinding insight set me right back on my behind, on my butt. And I was amazed to discover that not only was I running that fantasy about family, I used it to cope with other unpleasant situations. I'd tell myself that something was okay. And I would just back off until that other person got their self together, or I got myself together, and then we could all sing Kumbaya together. The attachment to this idea that I had informed all of my relationships. Now, don't misunderstand. I mean, I do live in the real world most of the time. And I practice my metaphysical principles. I take responsibility for my own actions and all of that. But this attitude meant that what I did most of the time was back away. Every time something got difficult, I left. I'd back away. I'd go sit in my own corner. It was sort of like, okay, RJ, you go sit in your corner, and I'll sit in my corner over here, and you go in your corner, and we'll all work on ourselves, but heaven forfend if we meet in the middle and actually work on something. So it was quite the revelation, and I'm pretty sure that my sister didn't wake up one morning and say, you know, Deborah's really screwed up about this. I think I'll get a horrible disease and die, and that'll wake her up. I think she probably had her own thing going there. But the process of talking my sister through her last year, and the process of talking my nephew through the first year without his mother, opened me up. It showed me the many ways that I limited myself. I saw that while I did move forward in my life, it was at the pace of a snail. Because if there was a difficulty in some area, I'd just back off. I'd wait until the other person or persons in question would get it together, or I'd find a way to get it together, or there were different people to work with. It never occurred to me that you could actually stay and work it out. It also never occurred to me that a person might not change. You could still have a relationship with them. Who knew, right? So, certainly I didn't want my sister to die. But I have to say, because of this insight, because I was able to get to the point where I saw I had this fantasy and able to release this fantasy, I was able to put myself in the direct line of fire. I became an active minister. In this profession, you see it all, you feel it all. It is the most difficult and most wonderful thing I have ever done. And I am forever grateful for that year of gut-wrenching grief that uncovered this source of fear and propelled me into a much richer and rewarding life. Thank you.